The key events leading up to the American Civil War date back to at least the early 19th century, beginning with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Passed by President James Monroe on March 3rd of that year, the compromise was a federal law that balanced the 12 free states and the 12 slave states, effectively banning slavery in the remaining Louisiana Purchase territory. However, this presented many problems and arguments concerning territorial extension in the South and the opposition of extension in the North. Decades later, in 1854, the compromise would be repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which organized the two territories and allowed settlers to decide on slavery through sovereignty. This would ultimately lead to the Bleeding Kansas violence, which also led to the founding of the Republican Party. In 1852, Harry Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel about the titular character, a noble slave, who meets a young girl, saves her life, and is purchased by her father. The novel sparked outrage in the South, highlighting the horrors of slavery and creating fierce opposition of slavery in the North. This only became more heated when the Dred Scott decision in 1857 denied citizenship to black people and made slavery legally possible in all U.S. territories. In 1859, John Brown, a Connecticut-born abolitionist who fought in Bleeding Kansas, led his 21 men to a raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The raid on Harper's Ferry aimed to seize federal weapons and destroy slavery, but he eventually was caught by the U.S. Marines under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. During his trial on November 2, 1859, he stated, quote, "If deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country, submit, let it be done." Unsurprisingly, he was hanged. This would turn out to be a pretty bloody significant turn of events, though, as it exacerbated the divide between the North and the South. The election of 1860 would be a major precursor to the war, as it further threatened slave institutions and heightened tensions between the North and the South. The election was held between John C. Breckinridge, a Kentucky Democrat, later a Confederate officer in the war, and Abraham Lincoln, a Republican, also from Kentucky, who was initially very quiet about his views on slavery until the Kansas-Nebraska Act began. Lincoln won the election by a landslide along with Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, making him the very first U.S. president of the Republican Party. Early in his presidency, Lincoln was very politically cautious, with his primary goal being to save the Northern Union and prevent slavery's expansion into new Western territory. Finally, the first military engagement came when Confederate forces bombarded the Union-held Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Following Lincoln's election, South Carolina had become the first U.S. state to secede from the Union due to the fear that the Lincoln administration would threaten slavery institutions. The secession would lead to other states doing the same, leading to the formation of the Confederacy. The Civil War officially began on April 12, 1861, and the Battle of Fort Sumter lasted another 34 hours before the Union surrender on April 14th. Get all that? We good? Okay, on to the war itself. The first major battle of the war was the First Battle of Bull Run, also known as First Manassas, which was fought on July 21, 1861. To be clear, this was not the first land battle. The first land battle was actually the Battle of Philippi on July 3rd, but Bull Run was much more significant, as it was the first battle to be fought on a large scale. During the battle, the Confederates were under the command of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard and General Joseph E. Johnston. Meanwhile, the Union forces were under the command of Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, who led the Army of Northeastern Virginia. During the brigade on Harry Hill, General Johnston had to make some critical reinforcements that were part of Johnston's army of the Shenandoah. His army, consisting of an estimated 10,000 men, arrived at the Manassas Gap Railroad. Meanwhile, on the front lines, General Thomas J. Jackson led the Virginia Brigade, which provided a stable defensive line that earned him the nickname Stonewall. Initially, under the command of General McDowell, Union forces had the upper hand, but the swift influx of new Confederate troops due to reinforcements caused the Union Army to go into a panic and retreat back to Washington, D.C. The battle's end was short and decisive, resulting in a Confederate victory, and would ultimately set the stage for the long, bloody conflict that the battles would become. Around 3,400 troops were killed in the First Battle of Bull Run, and as the war raged on, the death toll would rise even higher. As the war continued, the Union would see more victories, thanks to the replacement of General McDowell with General Ulysses S. Grant. The Battle of First Donelson and the Battle of Shiloh, the latter of which Union troops held a stubborn defensive line nicknamed the Hornet's Nest. Occurring for only 2 days in April 1862, the Battle of Shiloh resulted in roughly 24,000 casualties, twice the amount of the troops killed in Bull Run. Let me give more context. On April 6, 1862, Confederate troops launched a surprise attack on the Union camps near Pittsburgh Landing, and the Confederates were being led this time by General Albert Sidney Johnston, who was killed on the first day, and Confederates exhausted back to Corinth on April 7th when Grant's army launched a successful counterattack. The 7 Days Battles was the fourth major land battle of the war, and despite the Union's loss this time around, it would be important for several reasons. The battle lasted from June 25th to July 1st, 1862, and was a series of attempts by Union forces to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia. This time, General Joseph E. Johnston was replaced by a new Confederate general, Robert E. Lee. Yeah, remember him? The Marine colonel who captured John Brown following his little bullshit escapade on Harper's Ferry? Yeah, he's a general now, and what he did was he drove back General George B. McClellan's forces and foiled the Union's dastardly plans. His brilliant mind would carry on over to the Second Battle of Bull Run, where the Confederates, like the first battle, would decisively win again. The Battle of Antietam, also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, took place on September 17, 1862, and would go down as the bloodiest battle of the entire war. Despite its mass casualties of over 23,000 soldiers, holy shit, it is widely considered as the start of the turning point of the war and of the country in general. It enabled the Union to repel the first Confederate invasion and allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Photos of the battle were taken by photographer Alexander Gardner and brought the horrors of war to Americans for the very first time. In the end, the Union would claim victory, forcing Lee's army to retreat back to Virginia. The Union would, however, lose their lucky streak with the Battle of Fredericksburg, which lasted from December 11th to December 15th of 1862. Again, ranking among the deadliest battles in the war, an estimated 12,000 soldiers died, with more than 4,000 of those deaths occurring on the southern flank, with much of them being due to the use of urban combat. Less than 1 year later, the Battle of Chancellorsville would take place in the spring of 1863. It was ultimately a Confederate victory, but tragically Stonewall Jackson would lose his life due to being fatally wounded in friendly fire. A devastating loss for the Army. Not long after Chancellorsville came one of the deadliest and arguably most well-remembered battles of the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place on July 1st and ended on July 3rd, 1863. Over 7,000 soldiers were killed, along with combined casualties. Along with being bloody as it was also the war's turning point. It ended General Robert E. Lee's invasion of the North and also set the stage for the famed Gettysburg Address. It was by far the largest battle of the Civil War and remains the bloodiest battle in U.S. history. Following Gettysburg, it was made very clear that the Union was close to winning altogether and showed no signs of letting up. The Siege of Vicksburg happened on the 4th of July, 1863, and was another major turning point as the Union gained control of the Mississippi River. The Battle of Chickamauga would see the Confederates win again and was the first battle to take place in Georgia. Although it was a victory, it failed to achieve lasting success as the Union retreated back to Chattanooga, where it was later relieved. The Battle of the Wilderness occurred in May of 1864 and was the first stage of a major Union offensive towards the Confederate capital of Richmond. At this point, General Grant was named General-in-Chief by President Lincoln and was the start of Grant's overland campaign, where he directed the Army of the Potomac, aiming to destroy the Confederacy. Back in Georgia, there was another campaign being conducted, that being the Savannah Campaign, which was led by Union Major General William T. Sherman, better known as Sherman's March, or Sherman's March to the Sea. It was a brutal campaign that was carried out from Atlanta to Savannah and deployed over 60,000 troops. Basically, they destroyed everything that could coddle the Confederacy, ranging from railroads, bridges, food, farms, crops, livestock, to even people and their goddamn property. On the plus side, this move also liberated thousands of slaves and led to the capture of Savannah, which Sherman famously presented as a Christmas gift to Lincoln. I love that. As the war came to an end, the final battle didn't take place on land. Instead, it took place in a courthouse. The Appomattox Courthouse battle took place on April 9, 1865, and ended with Robert E. Lee agreeing to surrender his army to the Union, effectively ending the war. But wait, what about the slaves? Well, first and foremost, there was the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln delivered on January 1, 1863, effectively abolishing slavery. Months later, on November 19th, Lincoln delivered his more famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, 4.5 months after the battle took place. How's it go? Well, you all know it by heart. 7 years ago, our